Okay, it hit 5:10. So, hi everybody. Thanks for coming to class again. We are going to have an amazing guest speaker today. This is Dr. Kaggie Orrick. She graduated from the Yale School of Environment with a PhD in human-wildlife interactions, focused on human-wildlife interactions in Botswana. And her work at the California Wolf Project right now at Berkeley studies ecological and social science theories and advances our ability to do conservation science. So I'm really excited to introduce her. She's a postdoctoral scholar at Berkeley and doing lots of cool things with the California Wolf Project. So yeah, welcome her.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you guys. This is absolutely awesome. So my talk today is Introduction to Human-Wildlife Conflict. I'm going to really phrase it in terms of my experiences in my PhD, and I'm going to do a little bit of a longer-winded introduction of who I am and how I got here. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the California Wolf Project. And if you were in Arthur Middleton's class, you might have seen a couple of the slides, but I tried to make it a little bit different. But then we can just open it up to questions and discussion and kind of go from there. So just a little bit about where I'm coming from. I just started in June with Arthur Middleton and Justin Brashears with the California Wolf Project. That's through University of California, Berkeley, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Nat Geo. But a little bit before about how I got here. So I'm originally from San Francisco. So I grew up in this area, but I spent my summers going up to the Sierra Nevadas around Lake Tahoe. And really, I kind of thought that that was like the northern end of California, which clearly is not true. But I really loved kind of being in the outdoors and just hiking around there. You can see from when I was a very little kid with the most awesome bowl cut in the whole entire world, I wanted to work in the outdoors from the very, very beginning. But I didn't even know that a job like I have now even existed until I did a study abroad during my college career at Colby College in Namibia with an organization called Round River Conservation Studies. That was when I first kind of got my feet wet. Started learning about how cool birds were. I was doing a lot of hands-on work that was trying to understand how communities and wildlife could live together in Southern Africa. But I first always knew that I just wanted to work with animals, and I was thinking I'd be a vet, and I wasn't getting the grades that could have made me become a vet, so I was starting to look for other options and realizing that there could be something else. So for 3 years after I graduated college, I thought I was never going to go back to school again. So I took a 3-month unpaid internship in South Africa. My internship was specifically just studying mice on a geographically isolated mountain. I was not necessarily getting close to any large animals. I was just looking at shrews, cleaning poop, doing all the things. And at the end of those 3 months, a job opportunity opened up to work on the small game reserve that I was living on while also doing these small mammal trapping. I went and got my field guide license, and so for 3 years after college, I spent my time on a small field game reserve doing large carnivore research, feeding ecology, and basically tracking animals every single day, looking at them, understanding what they were eating, how they were moving. But while I was doing that, I was realizing that I wasn't necessarily finding answers that I had, answers to the questions that I had, and specifically how a small game reserve and how these kind of isolated mountaintops are being impacted by humans. So that was my first kind of itch to come back to school, and that's where I came back to the States. I got my master's at Columbia University, and with that I was specifically looking at how roads impact elephants on the small game reserve that I was working on. So I was able to use all the data that I had collected for 3 years and apply it to the masters that I was looking for. And I'll pause here and say, when I say that I wasn't a great student in college, I was not a great student in college. I was not going to be able to go get my master's at Columbia without gaining the field experience that I got in between that time. So I really needed to make sure, and I wanted to because it was fun, to be out in the field and gain those skills I am now basically a car mechanic. I can pick up any sort of scat that you might need. I dragged dead animals around. So I was gaining skills that you might not necessarily list on your CV, but that was the reason why my advisor chose me to go and get my master's, because he knew that I already had the field competency, that I could do that. So that's all to say is that looking for doors that open for you is always a great opportunity, and it doesn't necessarily need to be just academia. You can kind of go get those field experiences, and the fact that I came with a question as opposed to jumping into somebody else's academic question also made me more desirable. But at the end of my master's, I thought, academia, never again. I will never go back. I never want to, and so I went and worked in Botswana for 3 years. And it's there that I was doing community-based wildlife monitoring. And with that, that meant that I was driving around in the wilds of Botswana, counting different animals like elephants with community guards. And we were learning together how we could best monitor these wild populations out in the vast wilderness from cars instead of from vehicles. It was there that we were then talking about all of the conflicts with animals. So I was no longer thinking just about how people are impacting wildlife, but I was realizing that wildlife are really impacting people in the same way, if not even worse, in some situations. So these experiences and living and becoming friends with people who are living on the ground with this conflict really made me recognize that you need to be looking at both human-wildlife conflict, but also the benefits of living with wildlife, that there are pros and there are cons. And thus, I returned to academia because I had many questions. So my quest for my PhD was, again, to advance scientific literature, specifically around applied conservation. I was always an applied conservationist, and I was really feeling that conservation as a whole wasn't really centering people in how they're landscape planning. So my dissertation was looking at incorporating more anthropological theories into conservation design, specifically around human-wildlife interactions. And that was specifically taking place in Botswana. So again, I was applying all of the skills, the connections that I had made, and the people that I knew in Botswana to be able to leverage that and really understand my system for my PhD. And this is just to say that I can put up all these pretty pictures of animals and all the really cool things I did. It was also pretty gross in many different times. I've had wheels fall off, as you can see. These are flies just sitting on the top of my car, and the number of flies that I've had to brush off or kill or destroy from a cattle post is amazing. I've had animals such as honey badgers ripping into my tents, making me get up in the middle of the night, chasing them off. No sleep, lions removing shirts from laundry lines. All to say is that any presentation that you see here at school, you talk about with other people, you see in the paper, is a finished product. And I will say that for almost every single one of these, certainly all of these and others, it is a grind. It is frustrating, and like the monotony of checking camera traps every day and going out and doing some of this field work is tough. So it's just an acknowledgement of it does take a lot of grit and a lot of time, especially if you want to engage with people, and that's important for human-wildlife conflict, but just to say that it's not always just a dream. So that's kind of my long-winded introduction, but now a little bit about human-wildlife interactions, and I'm pulling directly from my thesis and trying to talk a little bit about it without giving you guys an hour and a half lecture about something that I spent 6 years doing. So in short, a human-wildlife interaction, there are people and there are wildlife that might move across the same landscape, but it's only when they're in the same time and the same place where they can actually have an encounter. And now these encounters can be negative or positive. We can all imagine a positive interaction of seeing a really cool bird on the campus. Sometimes they get excited seeing a coyote, but other people might not necessarily get excited about seeing a coyote. So again, these interactions can be positive and they can be negative. And the cast of characters in human-wildlife interactions are extremely vast. So I'm using human-wildlife interactions as opposed to human-wildlife conflict because it's a neutral term that refers to any encounter between wildlife and people, including any sort of resources that are valued by humans. So that could include cattle or livestock or anything like that. You will see people in the literature really like human-wildlife conflict. It's a buzzword, you can look it up. But really, anyone who's been working in human-wildlife conflict for a while really starts using human-wildlife interactions. So as you start diving into the literature, thinking about what you might be interested in, just think about all of the different terms that might be used for that as you do your search. Because people are really kind of looking at the whole picture instead of just through one lens. And what we know, though, about the conservation of large carnivores, it requires both the understanding the drivers that lead wildlife and people and cattle into those encounters with one another, whether it's positive or negative, and specifically their choice of actions that leads to that. So I would say that addressing environmental and human dimensions of human-wildlife interactions together really requires integrating ecology and the social sciences. And this is sometimes a bit of a problem, and it was for me when I was an undergrad, which was I really wanted to study the animals. Forget about the people. Like, I want to go hang out with lions, which is all well and good, but ultimately when you want to understand the entire issue, the entire problem, you really got to be thinking about it all. And I would also argue that there's no place in the world that is untouched by humans. Therefore, if you want to study any sort of animal, do any sort of ecology, you have to be thinking about people at least a little bit. So I'd argue that this applies no matter what. So for my PhD, what I did was demonstrate how the actions of wildlife and of people and of cattle all contribute to human-wildlife interactions, specifically in the Mahari landscape in Botswana. And what I was doing with that and how I was incorporating both the social and ecological aspects of actions and interactions between these three kind of cast of characters was a combination of resources and land use, as well as social structures, cultural and social norms, government structures, religious background, familial influences, and then also agency. Individuals' personal dispositions and their beliefs. And I'm not just saying about agency of individual people, I'm saying agency also of animals. There are different types of personalities of animals, some are bolder, some are shyer, and all of these play a role in how that encounter with one another might be. And so through the entire incorporation of all of these different aspects, that's how we can better understand human-wildlife interactions. So that, as a whole, was my dissertation. So why is it that the study of human-wildlife interactions is so difficult? And you could list a number of different reasons, but kind of the ones that I want to highlight to you guys today is that they're incredibly dynamic. It changes from time to time. If you have an interaction with if I had an interaction with an elephant, both that elephant and I are going to walk away and have a different interaction the next time we encounter one another or another one of our kind. So it's constantly changing, and if that interaction was good, then I might have better interactions with elephants moving forward. If that interaction was bad, I might go have really worse interactions, and that elephant might go have worse interactions with people. So they change quickly over time, and they're also very context specific. If you can't get the whole entire picture, then you might not necessarily understand what's happening on the ground. So to study human-wildlife interactions, you also really need to intimately know what's happening on the landscape and continually observing animals and talking to people. And that specifically for me, and kind of the way that I'm going to describe this a little bit, is also specifically between different animals. So that include between lions and between cattle. So species that both exploit anthropogenic resources but are also threatened by humans are key figures when I talk specifically about human-wildlife conflict. And in many countries, human-wildlife conflict occurs when wildlife have to navigate through this kind of patchwork of protected areas, of private lands, which could be fenced, and communal lands, which typically accommodate a higher human population. So they're kind of going from national parks to these private lands to these more high density areas of people. So depending on which species we're concerned with and we want to study, there are going to be different resources that that species is looking for and different risk that these individuals are willing to navigate when they go across these 3 different management areas. For my PhD, this is the area that I was studying. This is Maharihari. If you guys have ever seen the black-maned lions of the Kalahari, that is this green area just here. If you've ever seen lions swim through water, that's up in the Okavango Delta. So I was at this confluence of this really dry desert and this really wet area. The Okavango Delta flows into the Maharihari and then basically dries up in the Central Kalahari Game Reserve. This region has some of the highest human-wildlife conflict across Botswana, and has one of the largest wealth disparities. There are very, very rich ranchers and there are very poor subsistence farmers. It's also been an extremely important corridor for those black-maned lions from the Central Kalahari, getting up to the Okavango Delta, and then moving up to Angola, Namibia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. So there's been heavy interest here for a very long time. Something as inspirational as restoring migrations here, but also in just improving human-wildlife conflict. And when again, going back to this idea of context dependent and dynamic, part of the reason why this patchwork of management types, such as the protected areas, the private property, and the communal lands, is because people who are living on this landscape have different structures that they have set up. So ranches, the very rich private ranches, have these structures here that are permanent. You can see that the fencing is much more, it's just stronger than these acacia branches that are just used to keep the cows in. For the cattle posts, these subsistence ranchers, they either bring water from the river to their cattle post or they drive their cattle to water every single day, whereas these rich ranchers have these jojos, these huge tanks that are just filled up with water. So basically, again, you are already thinking, I'm sure, oh, cattle are gonna move across this landscape differently because they have different housing structures, they have different access to water, as opposed to in the cattle post. So depending on what property cattle are living on, they're gonna have different interactions with those predators. So just to kind of touch on what I did for my PhD in relation to all of this, first I wanted to understand wildlife. Again, you'll be shocked to know I'm going to talk about wildlife, I'm going to talk about people, and I'm going to talk about cattle. So in terms of understanding wildlife, I set up a 180 camera trap grid here in Botswana. The greens are the communal lands, the purples are the private lands, and the yellow is inside the national park. And basically I wanted to understand how wildlife were utilizing this landscape depending on these different management types. Ultimately, what I was able to show was that depending on the animal, there was a spatial domain shift, as in they were completely outside of that area. Wild dogs did not want to be inside the national park whatsoever. They wanted to be in the communal lands. I showed a habitat shift. Elephants wanted to be closer to water and farther away from people. Makes sense? And then there was a time shift. Lions were only active at certain times of night and not during the day at all when they were in the communal or the private lands compared to when they were inside the park and they were moving all around during the day. And that was because the risk was different inside the park than outside of the park. So all to say again, trying to understand how people are impacting wildlife, you can see these kind of differences throughout. And these are kind of the 3 main that you would see from human-wildlife interactions and conflict in general. But I also wanted to understand what cattle were doing. So I put GPS trackers on cows to understand how they were moving across the landscape in comparison to wildlife and in comparison to those management types, again, that I was talking about. And ultimately, so these are home ranges of the different cows that I had across the landscape. And the sweet water is good quality water. That was what they called it in Botswana. River water, obviously, and then salty water. The Jojo tanks were full of like very saline, which is not necessarily good for cows. And you can already see here that the home range size is different depending on the quality of water. So that management type, again, plays an important role in understanding how far the cow is roaming from their cattle post. But not only that, I was interested in what that meant in terms of them staying away from their cattle post, aka not being protected, and potentially being eaten by lions at night. And ultimately, again, what we saw is that with sweet water, there was a lot lower proportion of cattle escaping at night or leaving or not coming back to their home at night compared to those at the river or salty water. This is all to say, this is a lot of things I'm throwing at you, but all of this is to say that what people do impact the animals around and impact how human-wildlife conflict happens. People who have salty water or river water very possibly will have higher amounts of human-wildlife conflict. Their cattle will die more because of water quality, which is not something that people are exactly thinking about. They're thinking about proximity to a park or anything like that. So just be thinking about that when you start thinking about human-wildlife interactions and conflict. It also just highlights that the policies that are put in place, like who can have a well, what kind of quality of well people can have, all plays a role again in how human-wildlife conflict impacts you. I'll briefly touch a little bit on this, which is I also interviewed people because I was very curious about where people were identifying human-wildlife conflict. And I will confess to you that we didn't get that many camera traps of lions in the communal lands. So it was very important to be able to interview people and understand where they had identified hotspots of lions and other species, so that we could be able to map this and represent it, as opposed to saying, oh, there's definitely no lions there, which we knew that there was. So this is an example of what our participatory maps look like. Basically, we would provide a map and people would identify, this is circled here and it says lion up there, the wildlife in the dry area, but not necessarily the wet area. So we were able to then map that out and determine kind of different hotspots. So this is kind of the takeaway. All right, well, that little lion didn't cause any trouble, but this little lion did. But you can see here that there are clear where people have identified hotspots of conflict really show up on this map. People do know where those conflicts occur. And this has never been done before because everyone's done camera traps and been able to say, oh, there's no lions here, but there's clearly something that's happening here. So coming back to this again, depending on if you're a subsistence farmer or if you're a private rancher, knowing where your property is, knowing what kind of management style you have, knowing what policies are that you can have on your property will all depend on human-wildlife conflict. And again, so this draws back that I was hitting on resources, I was hitting on agency and social dispositions and policies that could all impact human-wildlife conflict. So you might ask, Kaggie, if you've been working your entire life in Southern Africa, why are you in California working with wolves? How did you get hired to do this? Which is, you can apply everything that I just told you to any system, which is very cool, very neat. And so I can use this to also be thinking about how wolves live across in California in the landscape. So instead of the Mahadi-Hadi landscape, we're in the California landscape. We're talking about wolves instead of talking about lions, but there are people and there are cattle. And we can still be thinking about resources across these three different characters, and then we can also be thinking about policies and agency within that. So in California, there is an expanding wolf population, and that brings many questions and many different challenges. California is really unique to the other western states that have wolves. We have a lot lower amount of prey available, so a lot lower resources that are around. We are a heavily modified landscape, pretty fragmented, through cattle allotments, through roads. There's not open, vast landscapes that wolves can roam. And we have a pretty large urban public that is not necessarily going to be is not impacted and will not be impacted by wolves moving around the landscape. This is all to show that wolf population in California specifically has increased and is only going to increase more, no matter what metric you use here. If you're thinking about year-end minimum counts, annual minimum reproduction, or annual maximum counts, they're here to stay and they're going to cause trouble. And that's specifically because 100 years ago, when the last wolf in California was shot before this new natural recolonization, there weren't as many beef cattle in the area, there weren't as many grazing allotments, and so all of these grazing allotments that you see are all in forested areas where wolves are normally found. So what we're seeing is that there's a huge overlap in a really great prey source because there's not that many natural prey, and I will say most cattle are a little bit dumber than deer. They haven't necessarily experienced predators, so they are often going to be killed more than deer if they have the choice. In terms of policies that we can be thinking about and how that applies to wolves as well, they are managed by CDFW, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. There are federal protections. We know the Endangered Species Act, but we also know the federal regulations, federal ideas for the next 3 years are going to be a little bit tricky. So it's very possible that wolves get delisted federally across the United States. However, and the northern Rocky wolves are actually already delisted, so they are allowed to be hunted. California specific protections, there's also the California Endangered Species Act. We all know that California ranges in terms of their protections and ideas, so it's pretty unlikely that that's going to change in the next 3 years. So there's no legal wolf hunting allowed in California, which is causing a lot of contention between the livestock producers and legislation and other environmentalists. So this is going to be a hot topic for the next 3 years, and probably there's going to be a lot of things published by Berkeley about this as well. So very interesting to kind of keep watch. So our California Wolf Project is specifically assisting the Department of Wildlife and Fish and Wildlife to help them with the management. They've been managing the wolf population. They will continue to manage the wolf population, but they need a little bit of help on the research, trying to understand social and ecological dimensions to understand human-wildlife conflict. So our basic questions are, where are they moving? What are they eating? How do they interact with animals around them? And how do they interact with people around them? This is the most updated range of wolf activity across California. If I overlaid the beef cattle production as well as the cattle allotments, you'd see a lot of overlap here. The most southern pack in Northern California Lake Tahoe is just here, so it comes relatively close to Truckee, and then all the way up to the Oregon border, which is where they've been naturally coming down from in the first place. But we're also seeing this pack in Southern California. We have seen other dispersing individuals come all the way down to LA before getting hit by a car. And that's all to say that California is a prime habitat for wolves. So not only are we not going to see them necessarily be delisted potentially anytime soon, but they're also here to stay because there's good habitat. Maybe not great prey, except for cattle, but there is good habitat. So what we need to be thinking about is how we can better help people when we understand human-wildlife interactions with wolves and cattle and people, because otherwise people are going to start shooting them illegally or laying out traps or anything like that. So we need to be thinking about, like, if they can get all the way down here, that they can get almost anywhere. So this is our team. We're under Arthur Middleton and Justin Brashears. There are 3 of us who are postdocs, and then we have a master's student, Christina Winters, and we also have a communication specialist, which I think is one of Arthur's. Arthur is a very brilliant individual, but I think this is also one of his more brilliant ideas, is that we have help now from someone who is actually trained in this to hand out stickers, to do communications parts, to get camera trap footage of wolves running with pups, and start talking, interviewing cattle producers about the impacts of wolves on their property, but really trying to get an actual genuine contextual information out to the general public about human-wildlife interactions, human-wolf interactions specifically. So very cool that our team can kind of do all of these other things, as well as getting undergrads to help us with some of our camera trap imagery, etc. So we feel pretty good about our team. Not only are we kind of doing that social media, LinkedIn type communications, but we're also trying to share information to the general public as well as producers. We've done a lot of tabling events. We have a newsletter that people can sign up, because a lot of the feedback that people are giving us from producers as well as just people on the ground is there's not enough information being shared. There's a lot of kind of secrecy around wolves. CDFW, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, hasn't necessarily been sharing all of that information. So one of our goals is to really just start sharing more information about where wolves have been historically, how this has come to be, kind of what our data, what we're collecting, and really getting to the people aspect of these interactions. This is all kind of to say, and I was saying this in the other class as well, but like, it's not the right question to say, are wolves going to be in California? The better question, or do you think wolves should be in California? The better question is, how can we better represent people? How can we better understand the context which human-wildlife interactions occur on this landscape, and better support those livestock producers and those individuals who are most impacted by wolves in California? Because I kind of said before, they're kind of here to stay, at least for a little bit. They're going to just keep coming from Oregon, even if they were all removed tomorrow. But we really should be thinking about, again, like the research that I was demonstrating in Botswana, how we can better understand the management aspects, the policies, the human action that is leading to human-wildlife conflict, as well as the actions of cattle, the actions of wolves. And with that, this is a QR code to our website if you're interested, my email address, as well as just the link to the website as well. And I'll take any sort of questions.
I feel like you touched a lot about like human interactions with both wildlife and cattle. What about wildlife and cattle interactions? If you could expand more on that.
Yes, I can. There is a lot of interesting changes in behavior that animals have, and one of the biggest things in cattle is more vigilance. So they're spending more time, instead of feeding, they're spending more time looking up, running away from a noise, even if it's not really a predator. So livestock producers are seeing a decrease in weight of their cattle. They're seeing a decrease in pregnancy success. So they're seeing these indirect costs. So their cattle might not necessarily be eaten by a wolf, but they're certainly seeing a loss in productivity and a loss in some sort of value. Cattle are also becoming a little bit more bold, strong. They're starting to herd up more. They're starting to kind of join together. They used to be very independent, and now they're kind of acting as a herd. So there have been some kind of very quick behavioral changes that have been occurring. And yeah, so that does that answer your question? Cool. Yeah.
I have two questions. So my first question is, around 200 years ago, we eradicated all of the grizzly bears and jaguars in California. And jumping back to the present, our current apex predators, aside from gray wolves, are now black bears and cougar populations. And I was wondering, how much would you attribute the wolves reintroduction due to a lack of competition now that there's only two other apex predators they have to deal with?
That is a great question, and this is what we keep getting asked too as well, saying there's too many apex predators already on the landscape. Wolves coming in is only continuing to decrease the deer population. Wow, deer population. So why are you bringing this in? Wolves have been here for longer. Wolves were here 100 years ago, so I wouldn't necessarily say that the lack of the grizzly is causing the wolves to kind of come in. It was just that they were so eradicated from the west that it took them a little bit of time to kind of come back over. But there's certainly, I think that there was just also more prey 200 years ago. So and not necessarily from cattle, but from other things. So I would say that there might have been able to support a healthier population of carnivores during that time. And I certainly strongly believe that no grizzlies should be reintroduced to California, which is something that they are talking about. So, but yeah, so I don't necessarily think that that's true, but there is something to be said about a cast of carnivores kind of coming in and depleting the prey population.
Thank you. And my second question, a few years ago, I read a book called American Serengeti, and it was talking about the story of coyotes in their westward expansion, because the idea was that ever since wolves were eradicated or extirpated from all the western states, coyotes saw their chance to start moving in, and even though they're a mesopredator, they kind of filled in the niche of the wolf. And I was wondering if you noticed a sudden drop in coyote populations because of this.
It's something we want to look at. We have not been able to analyze enough of our data yet, but it certainly is, they were this sweet little niche where they just kind of scavenged on either side of the really small carnivores and the really large ones. So yeah, I think that I certainly believe that we're going to see at least behavioral differences around wolves, and certainly, and potentially some population numbers as well. So yeah, great question.
Thank you.
Like with obviously wolves like being there to stay, and like knowing that there's going to be like with all this overlap, probably there will be like interactions between cattle and wolves. Like, is there kind of plans of like courses of action to avoid said interactions or to like prevent them or?
Yeah, great question. So a lot of Western states for the cattle depredations have a compensation program. California has a compensation program as well, and usually with the West, normally a compensation program is you get money if you lose cattle, which makes sense. But as a livestock producer told me, this kind of seems silly. I'd rather have money to protect my cattle than just to get money after it's dead. California also has done one of the more, not advanced, but more experimental compensation program that they not only had pay for a death, pay for depredation, but also a pay for presence that should have covered kind of indirect costs. So you got money regardless of if you had a loss or not, just because wolves were in the area, because probably your cattle were losing weight and you didn't get enough money. And then they were also doing mitigation strategies. So they were also paying people to do range riding. So having someone out on a dirt bike, kind of following their cows at night, chasing off animals. Flagery, which is just putting up big fences with flapping colors along the fence to scare off the wolves. So they were looking at kind of these other ways to mitigate. The problem is it's pretty expensive. This was a $3 million pilot program that was spent in a year. Then they weren't able to pick it back up again. So the compensation program is back, but it's only for depredations now. It's not for these other kind of mitigation or pay for presence. But yeah, so people are looking for that, and people are and CDFW is trying to find more ways to help, but it hasn't been moving as quickly as a lot of people want. One of the things that Arthur and Justin are really interested in is identifying funders and identifying kind of as we all know, academics love to use a lot of innovation to determine other ways that we might mitigate these strategies. So applying that.
Brett, what resources did you go to get like the internships and field research that you were able to get?
That is a great question. I applied the shit out of everything for a really long time. To even get that first internship, I spent months looking for a job and just kind of continually getting rejected. And that has kind of been a theme of my life, and that doesn't necessarily, that doesn't necessarily help any of you guys, but it is true that you're going to get rejected far more than you're going to get anything. And I kept saying yes to things that got me closer, that I wasn't necessarily, if you told 5-year-old Kaggie, you're gonna go work with wolves, I'd be like, fuck yeah, like that was my goal, and I'm gonna just do that. I'm gonna try to get there. But I didn't do that. I went around, like I was collecting mice. Mice was not necessarily exactly what I wanted to do in South Africa, but it got me to South Africa. And I knew other people were working on the game reserve and that I could take the tests and do the thing. So I took a lot of windows, even if I wanted, if the door was closed. So it was certainly that. It was certainly recognizing that I was more desirable for those internships if I had skills like I could drive stick, or that I could happily, I don't know, saw open a donkey if it was dead. Like I could do all those things, and I could prove that I was interested in those kind of things. Was extremely helpful.
And what was that like certificate or test you said you took at the end of the internship?
Oh, it's called VIGASA, the Field Guides Association to Southern Africa. So there are a lot of you can do it very cheap for free if you study on your own, but then there's a lot of like experiences where you could go out and like learn for 6 months in Southern Africa and then take the field guide license in the end. So I kind of just found a book and was like, okay, I'll just study that and then take the test. So, but it was finding those tangential things. So it was like, oh, I could become a field guide in Southern Africa if I can't necessarily get the research that I wanted to do.
If any of us were to study abroad in Africa, like in the field of conservation, are there any top tips you'd have for us?
Ooh, I would find a program that is more applied than not. I think that there are many incredible programs out there. If you wanted kind of the actual skills, you might want to look for a smaller organization than a larger one. If you're in a classroom of 50 people every single day, you're not necessarily getting all of the skills. I am extremely biased because the abroad program that I did, Round River Conservation Studies, also funded my PhD, and I was working with them. When I was working in Botswana, I was their staff member, and I'm now on the board of Round River Conservation Studies, so I also, again, am extremely biased in this abroad program that I love. But I do think that I think that Round River was incredible because it was 8 students. We were working on a larger conservation project the entire time. So I was working with Save the Rhino Trust and doing community monitoring out there. So it wasn't that I was just out there to take classes, I was out there to help with a project, and I also happened to be taking classes. So I think that there are many great, Justin did SIT, I think, and loved it, and it was incredible. So there are, I think anyone who went on any of their programs just like loved their programs. But yeah, I think it'd be finding skills along with being out there. So not just being able to walk away and say, oh, I did classes, being like, oh no, I worked on this project. You and your hand up.
Yeah, I was just curious, talked a lot about cattle in the Sierras. There's also a lot of smaller livestock. I know there's methods right now for the lions and things like that with dogs. Obviously wolves are a little bit of a different story compared to the coyotes or mountain lions that have been up there for the last 100 years as cattle ranchers have adapted to that. So curious if you guys have thought about with smaller livestock, the approach, or if you're even considering?
There have been a couple of people who've been using, what's it called? Like fenceless collars on cattle, so you can herd your cattle without having any sort of fences. So I think that that's gonna be a really interesting approach. Those collars, if you can link them up with the GPS collars that are on wolves, can give each other signals when they're close to each other. I think that's gonna be a really interesting kind of dynamic. That has been done in Southern Africa for like 10 years, and that just it hasn't been happening here, which I think is just, it's been really interesting to see the differences between the States and Southern Africa. Southern Africa, it's all about community-based conservation and talking to people, and out here it really hasn't been. So all to say is that like that could be certainly something that could work. Having more information, more sharing of information of where wolves are, so that people can go out and protect their cattle at that time, will also play a huge role, and CDFW is working on that. But yeah, there's a couple of cool possibilities with technology.
Okay, I guess I'll ask a question. Like, what would you say piqued your interest in wildlife in general, or why did you choose to study like in Africa first? What necessarily like put you on the path of where you're at now?
I knew from the beginning, as a kid with that funky bowl cut, that I also, that picture did not depict, I also had a rat tail. I was extremely cool. But I knew from the beginning I didn't want to work indoors. Like, I knew that I didn't want to be in an office, that I wanted to be outside and move. And that certainly has changed as I've gotten older, that I'm more interested in kind of the office work and the looking at the data, and I don't necessarily need to be outside every day, but I respected that I needed that from the beginning. So that's where it started. But as I kind of said, like, I never knew that working in the field like this could be possible. So it was only when the abroad program showed up that I was like, oh, that's possible. Like, I could go to Africa, okay. And then when I was there, I had 2 extremely badass women field leads, and I was like, oh, I could do that job. Like, that, it's not an impossible reach. I could actually get there. So that started my itch for Africa as well, because I'd had such a great experience with it in Namibia. And then, yeah, I just kept kind of applying for things over and over again.
Yeah, that's awesome. Guys, one more round of applause. QR code is up. I know we're a little bit early, but that means we have more time for individual questions. If anyone wants to talk to Kaggie personally about the California Wool Project or anything, come up, say hi. So, yeah.
Take more stickers.
Yeah, more stickers. We got so many. So, thank you guys.
Good luck with midterms and finals.